Welcome back to the yard. Today, part 2 of grinding, heat treating, and finishing the simple forged knife from the last video. I'm going to start off with a 60 grit belt on my belt grinder. And the first thing we're going to do, since this was a simple forged knife and I wanted to keep it mostly forged, is we're going to clean up the profile, but we are only going to clean up the profile of the edge. We're not going to touch the spine or any of the handle, only the edge, because the rest of it looks fine. And it will keep the character of having a hand forged and rough finish with hammer marks and everything. So we're going to clean this up. I'm developing a little bit of a recurve to it near the ricasso, between the ricasso and the belly. Once we're happy with that and how even it is, we're going to move on to grinding the bevels. We're going to start at fairly steep of an angle, and we're going to move in from the original edge to a general midway point between the two sides. We're going to try to establish that generally first, and then move the grind downward toward the spine. One of the methods I like to use to really hog off material is to hold the tip with one hand and the handle with the other and work on that ricasso to belly area and really grind that in, and then gently work that in, or smoothly work that in to the belly and to the tip. Right here you can see me using that technique. I'm really grinding in right there, and then I switch and grind that consistent angle into the belly and the tip. Now Walter Sorrells, for matching your angle that you've already established, describes it as kissing the belt, gently kissing the belt with the edge of the blade, and then slowly rocking it down. Actually, not slowly, quickly, but carefully rocking it down until you feel the entire bevel make contact with the belt, and then apply pressure. This is so that you don't mess up your grind line that you have running down the blade, because if you rock from spine to edge, you will mess up that clean, smooth line, and it won't look that great. Some things to note as you're grinding: you want to try to keep your ricasso from side to side pretty equal so that they are terminating in the same place. You want to keep the curve that you're developing on the ricasso fairly similar from side to side, and where the grind line terminates at the spine, you want to keep that smooth and consistent and terminating in the same place, if you can. One of the things that will determine these factors and the smoothness of the grind line as a straight line down the blade is affected by how you forge it. If you forge it at different thicknesses, like the tip is actually thicker than the rest of the blade, then you're going to have some differences there. Or if it's kind of hollowed out in the middle of the blade, you won't have a consistent grind line. I'm not too worried about the temperature as I'm grinding before heat treat, because I don't have a temper to ruin. I'm just grinding as much as I can before I can't hold it anymore. Which does happen fairly quickly when I'm having my fingers pressed up against the back of the blade. And scientifically, your fingers react to, I think, about 120 degrees. So once it hits that point, your fingers will actually just react to the pain. Now I have moved on to the slack belt because I decided a convex edge would be better for this blade, particularly since I wasn't getting a consistent edge angle or bevel angle. So I decided, best of both worlds, we'll just go for convex, and it's going to look cool. So I'm actually changing the angle of the grind. It's a little steeper near the ricasso and more shallow near the tip. As well as you can see, I'm rocking the grind with the handle pointing more toward the ground when I'm up near the tip. I just liked the way the lines from the grinding were looking as it was doing that. And there, the pre-heat treat grind is done. I'm not going to go above 60 grit for it because it doesn't really need it. Now I want to mention edge thickness before heat treat. You don't want to get it too thin because it could potentially warp or crack, but I'm going to be doing an oil quench, so it's not terribly important. But it is thicker down here at the ricasso and a little thinner up here. That's just some inconsistency with grinding, which I will take care of afterward. You can also see a residual plunge line from the platen before I went to the convex belt. I'm going to have to work on getting that out after heat treat, which I definitely do. I take off quite a bit of material after heat treat, but I do so slowly and only with the slack belt, so it's less damaging to the heat treatment. For heat treat, we're going to use our propane forge, and I'm going to go ahead and do something that I haven't done much of yet, which is a triple quench. For telling temperature, I'm going to generally be using a magnet until it gets above non-magnetic, and then I'm going to judge it by color, because I just want to go a little bit past non-magnetic for full hardening heat. So a triple quench involves heating it up to approximately non-magnetic or just above to this particular steel's critical or austenizing temperature, and then quenching it to below 900 degrees, which is essentially taking it from the heat treat temperature past the perlite nose, which is at 900 degrees, and then putting it back in the forge. Then you do that again, then you put it back in the forge, and then you do a final hardening, make sure that it's straight, and then let it cool to below 400 degrees, which completes martensite transformation from austenite. So I've got it in the forge, getting it up to temperature. I'm seeing that it's glowing, and so I pull it out and I check it against the magnet to make sure all of the material that I want to be non-magnetic is, which includes the ricasso and just slightly beyond into the handle. Once it's all non-magnetic, I'll put it back in the forge for a few seconds, and then I'll quench it, because I want to make sure that it has even heat and that it is all at that temperature. In the time it takes to pull the steel out and test it on the magnet and put it back into the quench, or then put it down into the quench, it will lose some heat. You'll notice that now that it has been quenched, it is magnetic again. Though it is not martensite, it is still austenite. It's magnetic. So then I put it back in the forge for a final heat. And for the final heat, I go a little bit past what I have been, because 1425 is generally not quite hot enough. So I'm going to go a little bit past that to closer to an orange heat, medium to bright cherry, and then I'll quench the blade. I am bringing it off camera to check straightness since it's my final hardening heat, and I want to make sure that it hasn't warped from other parts of the heat treatment. And you'll notice also I have the blade vertical, never horizontal in the forge, always vertical. That helps reduce warpage as well. Now I'm going to clean it up after it has been tempered. You can see the color there of the edge. It was gray after heat treat. Now it's kind of a dull wheat straw, and the entire blade has an oil finish all over it. So I'm going to clean it up with Scotch-Brite, which really isn't necessary. I didn't have to do that to the blade really, but it kind of helps smooth out and get any grime and stuff off the rest of the blade. Unless you want that oil finish as a raw oil finish, then don't Scotch-Brite it. I'm really just going for a scale finish, which might include some of the residual oil being burned onto the steel. And I was considering leaving the edge just like this and then just sharpening it, but I decided it would look better having been reground for a final finish instead of this rough heat treat finish. And it allows me to work out that residual plunge line from the first grind. But otherwise, the rest of the knife is finished. I'm not going to touch the spine, the flats of the blade, or the handle at all. Let's grind. Now I'm going to start off with a 120 grit belt. The highest I went before was a 60 grit. And this is a fresh 120, or at least fairly fresh 120, so it doesn't produce as much heat, and it will cut fairly well.
And this is the belt where I get rid of that residual plunge line and smooth out the new plunge line. It's nice and smooth, and just generally clean it up, refine the edge to all be approximately the same thickness. I knock off some of the super thin stuff and get back to it, maintaining my angles from before heat treat and smoothing everything out. Unless you overheat the blade, you generally won't have too much scale or pitting from heat treat, so you generally don't have to go too hard or heavy after heat treat, unless you overheated it or unless you were trying to avoid warping. Now we're going for a 240 grit, just to help clean everything up, and before we're going to a 400, which is going to be our final grit size. Now I'm going to stop us right here because I'm about to make a mistake, and it is called burning the tip. I'm going to move the blade not enough, and it's going to produce a lot of temperature right there and on the tip. So watch the belt and watch the tip. You can see I'm not really moving it across the belt that quickly, and then see that coloration, see that little spot on the blade right there? That is a burnt tip. I have ruined the temper, to a degree at least, on the tip, which is not necessarily a bad thing because the tip is fairly delicate. It could do with some more toughness, but you really want to be careful with this stuff because you can very easily burn the temper while grinding after heat treat. And one of the reasons to use the slack belt is because it doesn't produce as much heat. It's not as aggressive, meaning you feel like you have to grind a lot more, but it also does not produce as much heat, which makes you feel more safe, so you have to be even more careful about it. So now I'm at a 400 grit, finalizing the grind and making sure all of the grind lines, the scratch marks and the grit is all running even with each other so that they're all nice and smooth. It's not sharp transitions between the nice horizontal and then the kind of angled grind up near the tip. You just want to make sure it all looks good. And now we're going to sharpen it. I am using the slack belt to sharpen it, mostly because it has a recurve to the blade, and a recurve is really hard to sharpen on a flat platen or any sort of just flat stone because it creates a hollow there which isn't in contact with the belt. You'd have to use like the corner of the belt or the edge. And then for final sharpening, I'm using buffing wheel. I don't apply any buffing compound to it at this point. It already has some in there. I just pass it out back and forth multiple times. That refines the burr and just smooths it all out. And beyond that, the knife is basically done, except for a sheath, which we'll be doing in the next video. See you then.